Sleep functions as one of the body's most powerful regulators of metabolic health, yet it is often treated as an expendable luxury rather than a biological necessity. The relationship between sleep and metabolism runs far deeper than most people realize. Every night as we drift into sleep, our body undergoes complex hormonal and cellular recalibrations that directly influence how we process and utilize glucose. When sleep is restricted or disrupted, these systems become misaligned, leading to impaired glucose regulation, elevated insulin levels, and over time, insulin resistance. This process begins quietly and subtly, but the consequences are profound, shaping the foundation for chronic metabolic diseases that develop later in life. During healthy, sufficient sleep, the body maintains a delicate rhythm of hormonal balance. Insulin, cortisol, growth hormone, and melatonin interact in a precise sequence to regulate blood glucose and energy storage. When this sequence is interrupted by sleep deprivation, cortisol levels rise, growth hormone release diminishes, and insulin sensitivity drops. The brain interprets sleep loss as a form of stress, activating the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, which floods the system with stress hormones. These hormones promote the release of GLUT to the bloodstream to ensure immediate energy availability, a survival mechanism that made sense in the context of ancient threats, but becomes detrimental in modern life. In a world where physical exertion rarely follows sleep loss, that extra glucose lingers, forcing the pancreas to release more insulin. The body begins to adapt to this constant state of high insulin exposure by becoming less responsive to it. That adaptation, insulin resistance, is the first domino in a cascade that leads to prediabetes, obesity, and systemic inflammation. Sleep acts like a nightly reset button for the endocrine system. Deep, slow wave sleep, which occurs predominantly in the first half of the night, is when the brain and body synchronize to restore homeostasis. Heart rate slows, blood pressure drops, and the parasympathetic nervous system dominates, allowing tissues to recover from daytime stress. Within this state, muscle and liver cells become more insulin sensitive, efficiently storing glucose and rebuilding energy reserves. But when sleep is shortened or fragmented, deep sleep becomes truncated. The body misses out on that critical window of metabolic recalibration, leaving glucose levels higher and insulin sensitivity lower the next day. Over time, this daily misalignment accumulates, much like compound interest in the wrong direction. The evidence for sleep's metabolic role is strikingly consistent. In controlled studies, healthy young adults restricted to just 4 to 5 hours of sleep per night for a single week show reductions in insulin sensitivity equivalent to those seen in early stage diabetes. This isn't a chronic condition developing over years. It's a reversible, immediate physiological response to inadequate sleep. When normal sleep is restored, insulin sensitivity rebounds within days, which tells us the body is extraordinarily responsive to sleep as a regulatory input. In this sense, sleep is not simply a passive state of rest. It is an active form of metabolic therapy that occurs naturally when given the opportunity. The impact of sleep deprivation extends beyond insulin signaling alone. The body's appetite regulating hormones also shift dramatically. Leptin, which signals fullness, decreases, while ghrelin, which stimulates hunger, rises. The result is increased appetite, particularly for high glycemic energy dense foods. This creates a feedback loop where poor sleep leads to poor dietary choices, further straining glucose control and perpetuating insulin resistance. The craving for quick energy, sugar, and refined carbohydrates isn't a lack of willpower, but rather a biological adaptation driven by hormonal disruption. The brain, deprived of restorative sleep, seeks immediate energy sources to compensate for its fatigue, but this compensation worsens metabolic instability. Circadian rhythms add another layer of complexity. Every cell in the body operates on a roughly 24-hour cycle, dictating when genes related to glucose metabolism, fat storage, and energy production are turned on or off. Sleep aligns these cycles through light, dark signaling, and hormonal timing. When we push our sleep schedules late into the night, expose ourselves to artificial light, or maintain inconsistent sleep patterns, these rhythms lose synchronization. The result is metabolic chaos, glucose intolerance during nighttime hours, elevated fasting glucose in the morning, and reduced fat oxidation. Over months and years, this internal dysynchrony accelerates metabolic aging, even in individuals who appear outwardly healthy. Understanding sleep as a metabolic regulator reframes the way we think about health optimization. Nutrition and exercise often receive the most attention, but without sufficient sleep, their benefits are blunted. Exercise-induced improvements in insulin sensitivity are partially reversed when recovery sleep is inadequate. Dietary strategies designed to stabilize blood sugar work far less effectively in the context of sleep debt. The body cannot compensate for what it loses when sleep is sacrificed. Sleep is the foundation that allows every other intervention to work synergistically. Without it, even the most disciplined lifestyle unravels. At a molecular level, sleep deprivation alters mitochondrial function, increasing oxidative stress and impairing glucose transport within muscle cells. These microscopic changes accumulate over time, silently eroding metabolic efficiency. The result is that the same meal that once produced a modest glucose response now triggers a prolonged spike, demanding more insulin to restore balance. Eventually, the pancreas struggles to keep up, and fasting insulin remains chronically elevated, a state that quietly fuels aging, inflammation, and cardiovascular risk. When viewed through the lens of longevity science, sleep emerges not as a passive downtime, but as an active process of metabolic regulation and cellular repair. The body's nightly rituals are not optional, but essential, orchestrating the very systems that determine how efficiently we process energy and how long we maintain metabolic youth. Every night of quality sleep is a silent investment in insulin sensitivity, mitochondrial resilience, and long-term health span. The body's sensitivity to insulin is not a fixed trait. It fluctuates dynamically based on daily behaviors, one of the most influential being sleep duration. While most people associate insulin resistance with years of poor diet or inactivity, research shows that the decline in insulin sensitivity can occur astonishingly fast when sleep is restricted. In fact, just a few nights of insufficient sleep can trigger metabolic changes that mirror early stage diabetes. This rapid onset of insulin resistance underscores how tightly the body's metabolic systems are linked to the sleep-wake cycle, and why recovery through sleep is so crucial for maintaining glucose balance. In one of the most cited studies on this topic, researchers at the University of Chicago restricted healthy young adults to 4 or 5 hours of sleep per night for a single week. By the end of that short period, insulin sensitivity had dropped by more than 30%. This means that their bodies were using insulin less efficiently to move glucose out of the bloodstream and into cells. What's even more striking is that their blood sugar profiles resembled those of individuals with prediabetes. Yet, when these same participants were allowed to recover with normal sleep, their insulin sensitivity rebounded, confirming that the impairment was reversible, but also emphasizing how fragile metabolic stability can be. The mechanisms behind this phenomenon are multifaceted and rooted in the body's stress response. When sleep is shortened, the brain interprets it as a physiological stressor, activating the sympathetic nervous system and the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. This cascade releases cortisol, a hormone that promotes the production of glucose in the liver, while simultaneously reducing the ability of muscle and fat cells to respond to insulin. The result is a state of elevated blood glucose and elevated insulin, a combination that places strain on the pancreas and disrupts normal metabolic homeostasis. What makes this effect particularly concerning is that it occurs in people who are otherwise healthy, demonstrating that sleep loss alone can induce a temporary diabetic-like state. Another layer to this relationship involves the circadian rhythm of insulin secretion and glucose tolerance. Insulin sensitivity is naturally higher in the morning and decreases as the day progresses, a rhythm governed by the body's internal clock. Sleep deprivation blunts these circadian rhythms, flattening the curve of insulin responsiveness and creating a mismatch between when we eat and when the body is best equipped to process nutrients. Late night eating, which often accompanies sleep loss, amplifies this misalignment. Because glucose tolerance is at its lowest during the night, consuming food in that window leads to prolonged elevations in blood sugar and a higher insulin burden. Over time, this pattern contributes to chronic metabolic dysfunction. The body's inflammatory pathways also play a significant role in the rapid onset of insulin resistance under sleep-deprived conditions. Even short-term sleep loss triggers an increase in pro-inflammatory cytokines such as interleukin-6 and tumor necrosis factor alpha. These molecules interfere with insulin signaling at the cellular level, reducing glucose uptake by skeletal muscle and promoting lipid accumulation within the liver. The resulting metabolic stress further reduces insulin sensitivity, creating a self-reinforcing cycle in which inflammation and insulin resistance feed off each other. This mechanism helps explain why chronic sleep deprivation has been associated not only with diabetes, but also with cardiovascular disease and obesity, conditions that share inflammation as a common denominator. Hormonal disruptions add another layer of complexity. Sleep restriction leads to an increase in evening cortisol and a decrease in leptin, the hormone responsible for signaling fullness, while ghrelin, the hunger hormone, rises. This combination increases appetite and specifically drives cravings for high carbohydrate, high fat foods. In the short term, these dietary choices provide quick energy to a fatigued brain, but they also cause repeated glucose surges that demand more insulin. Over time, this pattern contributes to insulin resistance, both directly through hormonal effects and indirectly through altered eating behavior. Thus, sleep deprivation doesn't merely affect how insulin works, it also changes the environmental context in which insulin must function. The interplay between sleep and insulin sensitivity also extends to the nervous system. Sleep deprivation alters autonomic balance, increasing sympathetic tone and reducing parasympathetic recovery. Elevated sympathetic activity causes blood vessels to constrict and promotes the release of catecholamines such as epinephrine and norepinephrine. These hormones, while useful in acute stress situations, impair glucose uptake in peripheral tissues when chronically elevated. As a result, blood sugar remains high and the pancreas must secrete more insulin to compensate. The heightened neural arousal that accompanies poor sleep effectively shifts the body into a state of metabolic emergency, prioritizing short-term energy availability over long-term balance. What makes these findings so significant is their immediacy. People often underestimate how quickly metabolic health can deteriorate, assuming that meaningful changes take months or years. The reality is that just a handful of nights with 4 or 5 hours of sleep can push the body toward insulin resistance, setting off a chain reaction that affects hunger, mood, cognition, and fat storage. The reversibility of these effects offers hope, but it also emphasizes the importance of daily consistency. Restoring sleep doesn't just make us feel better, it restores insulin sensitivity, lowers cortisol, normalizes appetite hormones, and reestablishes circadian alignment. The evidence makes it clear that sleep is not a passive state, but an active regulator of glucose metabolism, one whose absence can rapidly destabilize even the healthiest physiology. When sleep is disrupted or insufficient, one of the first systems to react is the body's stress response, specifically through the release of cortisol. Cortisol is a glucocorticoid hormone produced by the adrenal glands that plays a vital role in maintaining energy balance, regulating inflammation, and supporting the body's response to stress. Under normal conditions, cortisol follows a predictable circadian rhythm, peaking in the early morning to help us wake up and gradually declining throughout the day, reaching its lowest point at night to allow the body to rest and repair. However, when sleep deprivation occurs, this rhythm becomes dysregulated and cortisol levels remain elevated well into the night and early morning hours. This persistent elevation sets off a chain of metabolic disturbances that directly impair insulin sensitivity and glucose regulation. The interaction between cortisol and insulin is a finely tuned balance that determines how effectively the body can store and utilize energy. Insulin promotes the uptake of glucose into muscle and fat cells, allowing blood sugar levels to stay within a healthy range. Cortisol, on the other hand, works to increase glucose availability during periods of stress by stimulating the liver to produce glucose through gluconeogenesis. In small, acute doses, this mechanism is adaptive. It ensures that the brain and muscles have enough fuel in emergencies. But when cortisol levels remain chronically high due to ongoing sleep deprivation, the system becomes maladaptive. The constant signal to produce more glucose keeps blood sugar elevated, while the tissues that normally absorb glucose become less responsive to insulin. Over time, this results in higher fasting glucose, elevated insulin levels, and eventually insulin resistance. The physiological consequences of this imbalance extend beyond glucose metabolism alone. Elevated cortisol during sleep loss also alters fat metabolism by promoting lipolysis, the breakdown of stored fat into free fatty acids. While this might sound beneficial, in excess, these circulating fatty acids accumulate in muscle and liver cells, interfering with insulin signaling. This process, known as lipotoxicity, further reduces the ability of cells to respond to insulin, creating a metabolic bottleneck where glucose and fats both remain in circulation instead of being efficiently used for energy. In addition, high cortisol promotes visceral fat deposition, fat that accumulates around internal organs. This type of fat is metabolically active and secretes inflammatory cytokines that exacerbate insulin resistance, forming a feedback loop that reinforces the problem. Another important dimension of cortisol's impact during sleep deprivation involves its effect on the autonomic nervous system. Chronic activation of the stress response shifts the body towards sympathetic dominance, the fight or flight state at a time when it should be in parasympathetic recovery mode. This sympathetic overactivity increases heart rate, raises blood pressure, and diverts resources away from metabolic repair. The result is a system that remains on high alert, prioritizing immediate survival over long-term homeostasis. In this state, glucose uptake by skeletal muscle decreases, not because the muscle is incapable, but because the body is intentionally conserving energy for perceived emergencies. Over time, the repeated activation of this system rewires how insulin and cortisol interact, turning what should be short-term stress adaptation into a chronic metabolic burden. The relationship between sleep, cortisol, and insulin also involves the brain's regulation of the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. When sleep is cut short, particularly during the slow wave and RAM stages, the brain fails to suppress the HPA axis effectively. The result is an inappropriate continuation of cortisol secretion into the night. This disrupts not only the next morning's hormonal rhythm, but also the timing of insulin release. Normally, insulin secretion follows a diurnal pattern that anticipates food intake during waking hours. Elevated nocturnal cortisol confuses this signal, leading to insulin secretion at the wrong time and desensitizing cells to its effects. This misalignment between hormonal signals and energy demand is one of the defining features of early insulin resistance induced by poor sleep. The biochemical changes caused by cortisol dysregulation are measurable and significant. Studies have shown that even partial sleep restriction, sleeping 4 hours a night for a week, can increase evening cortisol levels by up to 45%. This rise correlates directly with reductions in glucose clearance rates and increased fasting insulin. Moreover, elevated cortisol has been linked to decreased levels of adiponectin, a hormone produced by fat cells that enhances insulin sensitivity. Lower adiponectin further worsens glucose uptake, pushing the system deeper into metabolic dysfunction. The combined effect of high cortisol, low adiponectin, and persistent sympathetic activation is a perfect storm for insulin resistance and systemic inflammation. What makes this relationship particularly problematic is how easily it becomes self-perpetuating. Sleep deprivation increases cortisol, which in turn interferes with sleep quality, making it harder to achieve deep, restorative rest. The cycle continues night after night, gradually reshaping the body's metabolic landscape. Cortisol also impacts appetite regulation by influencing leptin and ghrelin, increasing hunger and preference for high-calorie foods. This behavior reinforces elevated blood glucose levels and further challenges insulin signaling. Essentially, the hormonal environment created by sleep loss tricks the body into believing it is under constant threat, prioritizing immediate energy access over metabolic efficiency. Breaking this cycle requires understanding that sleep is not merely rest, but an active regulator of hormonal balance. Restoring adequate sleep duration and consistency helps reset the HPA axis, normalize cortisol rhythms, and reestablish the body's sensitivity to insulin. In individuals who experience chronic stress or irregular sleep schedules, cortisol management through behavioral and lifestyle interventions, such as maintaining consistent bedtimes, minimizing late night light exposure, and engaging in stress, reducing practices like meditation or controlled breathing, has been shown to restore metabolic function. Sleep, therefore, acts as the most natural and potent means of cortisol regulation, ensuring that the delicate equilibrium between stress and metabolism remains intact. The science is clear: without sufficient sleep, cortisol remains elevated, and the price the body pays is insulin resistance, impaired glucose control, and accelerated metabolic aging. Sleep loss does not simply make a person tired. It initiates a complex hormonal shift that alters how the body regulates hunger and energy use. Two of the most important hormones in this equation are leptin and ghrelin. Leptin, produced by fat cells, sends signals to the brain that indicate energy sufficiency and satiety, essentially telling us that we have enough fuel and can stop eating. Ghrelin, produced in the stomach, does the opposite. It stimulates appetite and encourages food intake, particularly for calorie-dense foods that can rapidly replenish energy. Under normal conditions, these hormones work in tandem, rising and falling predictably across the day to keep food intake balanced. However, when sleep duration or quality is compromised, this balance breaks down. Leptin levels fall, ghrelin levels rise, and the brain receives a false signal of energy deficit even when the body has adequate stores. This hormonal disruption creates a powerful biological drive to eat, and the cravings that follow are rarely for nutrient-dense foods. Instead, they skew towards simple carbohydrates, sugars, and fats, the very foods that cause rapid spikes in blood glucose and insulin levels. This is not coincidence, but adaptation. When sleep deprived, the body perceives itself to be in a state of stress and energy shortage, so it craves foods that can be quickly converted into glucose. The immediate result is a surge in blood sugar, followed by a surge in insulin to clear it. Repeated over days and weeks, these cycles of overeating and glucose fluctuations erode insulin sensitivity. The body becomes less efficient at responding to insulin, forcing the pancreas to produce more of it to maintain stable glucose levels. Over time, this chronic hyperinsulinemia becomes a central driver of metabolic disease. The appetite changes driven by sleep deprivation have been confirmed in controlled studies. Participants limited to 4 or 5 hours of sleep per night consumed significantly more calories than when they were well rested, with the largest increases coming from late night snacking. Neuroimaging studies show that sleep-deprived individuals exhibit heightened activation in the brain's reward centers in response to food cues, particularly in the amygdala and orbitofrontal cortex. These regions are involved in impulsivity and emotional decision-making. In contrast, activity in the prefrontal cortex, the area responsible for rational control and long-term planning, declines with sleep loss. This shift in neural activity explains why people are more likely to reach for a donut or bag of chips after a poor night of sleep, even when they consciously intend to make healthier choices. The brain's metabolic regulation is not purely logical. It is deeply hormonal and influenced by the state of rest or fatigue. Beyond hunger, sleep deprivation also affects energy expenditure. Fatigue reduces spontaneous physical activity and lowers the thermic effect of food, the energy the body uses to digest and metabolize nutrients. So not only does one eat more when sleep deprived, but the calories consumed are burned less efficiently. This creates a dual impact: increased intake and reduced expenditure, both which contribute to weight gain and fat accumulation. particularly around the abdomen. This visceral fat is metabolically active and releases inflammatory cytokines that further impair insulin signaling. The result is a feedback loop in which poor sleep increases appetite. Appetite leads to fat gain, and fat gain exacerbates insulin resistance, all while inflammation intensifies the metabolic disturbance. Another key piece of this puzzle involves circadian misalignment. The timing of food intake is tightly linked to the body's internal clock. Under normal circumstances, the body expects most calories during daylight hours when insulin sensitivity is highest and energy demand is greatest. Sleep deprivation often pushes eating into the night when insulin sensitivity is naturally lower. Late night eating in a sleep-deprived state causes prolonged postprandial glucose elevations because the pancreas is less efficient at secreting insulin during nighttime hours. Over time, this pattern contributes to higher fasting glucose levels and a metabolic environment that favors fat storage rather than oxidation. This circadian disruption magnifies the metabolic consequences of hormonal imbalance, creating a situation where even modest sleep restriction can have disproportionately large effects on insulin sensitivity. Leptin and ghrelin are not the only hormones affected. Sleep loss also influences peptide YY and endocannabinoids, both of which modulate appetite and food reward. Peptide Y, secreted by the gut after eating, decreases appetite, but its levels are reduced when sleep is curtailed. Endocannabinoids, on the other hand, rise with sleep deprivation, amplifying the pleasure derived from eating, particularly from sugary or fatty foods. Together, these changes make the sleep-deprived brain not only hungrier, but also more susceptible to food cues and less responsive to satiety signals. The person feels compelled to eat, enjoys food more intensely, and has a harder time stopping. These combined hormonal shifts create an environment in which maintaining stable glucose and insulin levels becomes nearly impossible. This interplay between sleep, appetite, and metabolism demonstrates that insulin resistance does not develop in isolation. It is the culmination of repeated nightly hormonal misfires that collectively distort energy regulation. A single night of poor sleep can alter leptin and ghrelin levels by up to 20%, a physiological change that makes it almost inevitable that caloric intake will rise the next day. Multiply this effect by weeks or months, and the metabolic toll becomes clear. Chronic sleep deprivation transforms the hormonal landscape into one that promotes overeating, fat accumulation, and glucose dysregulation. Even in individuals who maintain consistent calorie intake, shifts in nutrient timing and hormonal balance are enough to blunt insulin sensitivity. Restoring sleep consistency reverses many of these changes. When the body receives adequate, high-quality sleep, leptin levels normalize, ghrelin subsides, and appetite control is restored. The drive to seek quick energy fades, insulin sensitivity improves, and the brain regains its ability to regulate reward-based eating. This relationship illustrates a fundamental truth of metabolic health, appetite, energy balance, and insulin function are not governed solely by willpower or diet, but by the biological rhythm that sleep anchors each night. Deep sleep serves as the biological reset point for nearly every metabolic system in the human body. It is during this stage that the brain and peripheral organs synchronize their activity, allowing hormones, enzymes, and signaling molecules to recalibrate in ways that are essential for glucose control and insulin sensitivity. Unlike the lighter stages of sleep, where the rapid eye movement phase associated with dreaming, deep sleep is a state of profound physical restoration. Heart rate slows, breathing stabilizes, and the body's energy expenditure drops to its lowest level. This decrease in energy demand enables the body to focus on repair and recovery, processes that have direct implications for how efficiently cells respond to insulin. When deep sleep is shortened or fragmented, these metabolic recalibrations are disrupted, leaving the body less capable of regulating blood glucose and maintaining insulin sensitivity the following day. One of the most important hormonal events that occurs during deep sleep is the surge of growth hormone. This hormone is often misunderstood as being primarily related to muscle growth or childhood development, but in adults, it plays a crucial role in metabolism. Growth hormone promotes the uptake of amino acids into tissues, stimulates fat breakdown for energy, and helps maintain normal glucose levels by counterbalancing insulin's effects. During the first few cycles of deep sleep, growth hormone is secreted in large pulses that are absent during wakefulness. When sleep deprivation limits the duration of deep sleep, these pulses become blunted or disappear altogether. As a result, the body shifts toward a metabolic profile characterized by reduced fat oxidation, elevated blood sugar, and diminished insulin responsiveness. This lack of growth hormone release can mimic some of the same patterns seen in aging, where growth hormone naturally declines and insulin resistance gradually develops. Another defining feature of deep sleep is its influence on the autonomic nervous system. As the body transitions into slow wave sleep, sympathetic nervous activity declines while parasympathetic tone increases. This shift is critical because sympathetic activation raises glucose levels through the release of catecholamines like epinephrine, which stimulate the liver to release stored glycogen. When sympathetic dominance persists, as it often does in sleep-deprived individuals, glucose levels remain elevated and tissues are constantly exposed to high levels of insulin. Deep sleep counteracts this by suppressing sympathetic output, reducing nighttime glucose production, and restoring the body's sensitivity to insulin. It is essentially the period when the metabolic brakes are applied, allowing cells to reset their responsiveness to insulin signals after a day of nutrient intake and activity. Without sufficient deep sleep, the body remains in a mild state of metabolic overdrive with higher morning glucose levels and impaired post-meal glucose clearance. Cellular repair processes also peak during deep sleep, particularly within muscle and liver tissue, both of which are major sites of glucose utilization. These organs rely on adequate sleep to restore glycogen stores and to repair oxidative damage accumulated during waking hours. Mitochondrial biogenesis, the process by which new energy-producing mitochondria are formed, is enhanced during this time, improving the body's overall capacity to metabolize glucose and fat. When deep sleep is truncated, this nightly renewal is incomplete and mitochondrial efficiency declines. Over time, cells require more insulin to absorb the same amount of glucose, which is one of the earliest physiological signs of insulin resistance. The synchronization between deep sleep and circadian rhythms further reinforces its metabolic importance. Core body temperature, melatonin secretion, and glucose metabolism follow tightly regulated cycles that align with the light-dark pattern of day and night. Deep sleep usually occurs when core temperature is at its lowest and melatonin is at its peak, conditions that favor energy conservation and glucose stabilization. When people maintain irregular sleep schedules or stay awake late under bright artificial light, this synchronization breaks down. The body enters sleep at a higher temperature and lower melatonin level, both of which impair the quality of deep sleep. The resulting hormonal misalignment reduces the effectiveness of the metabolic reset that should occur overnight, leading to elevated fasting glucose and reduced insulin sensitivity the next day. Scientific evidence supports the idea that even modest disturbances in deep sleep can have measurable metabolic effects. In experiments where researchers selectively suppressed slow wave sleep without reducing total sleep time, participants exhibited significantly reduced insulin sensitivity and impaired glucose tolerance after only a few nights. This means that it is not just the quantity of sleep that matters, but the quality, particularly the time spent in deep non-REM stages. In real-world settings, factors like caffeine consumption, alcohol use, late night screen exposure, and chronic stress all erode deep sleep quality, gradually undermining metabolic function even in people who appear to get enough total sleep hours. The physiological consequences of deep sleep loss extend into the following day in ways that can easily be mistaken for poor lifestyle habits. People who lack sufficient deep sleep experience greater fatigue, reduced physical endurance, and increased hunger. These symptoms often lead to less physical activity and higher caloric intake, further worsening insulin resistance. The resulting metabolic state becomes self-reinforcing. Poor sleep leads to impaired glucose control, which contributes to inflammation and hormonal disruption, which then makes deep sleep even harder to achieve. Breaking this cycle requires prioritizing sleep hygiene, maintaining consistent bedtimes, minimizing stimulants, and creating a dark, cool sleep environment to allow the body to achieve and sustain deep sleep is not just a passive state of rest, but an active and necessary process of metabolic recalibration. It is the time when the body restores its sensitivity to insulin, stabilizes glucose levels, and repairs cellular damage accumulated during the day. When this process is compromised, every aspect of metabolic regulation suffers, from hormone balance to mitochondrial function to appetite control. Each night of high-quality deep sleep acts as a protective mechanism against insulin resistance, while each night of deprivation erodes that protection, inching the body closer to metabolic dysfunction and accelerated aging. Improving sleep quality and duration is one of the most powerful yet underutilized interventions for enhancing metabolic health and extending longevity. While diet and exercise are widely recognized as tools for preventing insulin resistance and promoting health span, sleep sits at the foundation of these behaviors. Without adequate sleep, even the most disciplined nutrition and fitness habits yield diminished results. Sleep serves as the biological synchronizer that aligns hormonal rhythms, immune function, and cellular repair. When it is optimized, the entire metabolic system becomes more efficient, resilient, and adaptive. Conversely, when it is neglected, metabolic stress accumulates, increasing the risk of insulin resistance, chronic inflammation, and premature aging. Optimizing sleep begins with respecting the circadian rhythm, the internal clock that governs nearly every physiological process. This rhythm operates on a roughly 24-hour cycle influenced by light exposure, temperature, and behavioral cues. Sleep that aligns with the body's natural circadian timing enhances insulin sensitivity, improves glucose tolerance, and supports proper hormone secretion. When sleep is delayed, fragmented, or occurs at inconsistent times, the circadian rhythm becomes desynchronized. This misalignment confuses the body's internal timing mechanisms, leading to disruptions in melatonin release, cortisol regulation, and glucose metabolism. Over time, such disturbances mimic the metabolic effects of chronic sleep deprivation, even if total sleep duration remains unchanged. Maintaining consistent sleep and wake times, particularly exposure to morning sunlight and avoidance of bright artificial light in the evening, helps stabilize this rhythm and enhances the body's ability to regulate insulin efficiently. Temperature regulation also plays a significant role in sleep optimization. The human body naturally cools as it prepares for rest, signaling the brain to transition into deeper stages of sleep. A cooler sleep environment around 18 to 20 degrees Celsius facilitates this thermoregulatory process and promotes more time spent in slow wave and REM sleep, both essential for metabolic restoration. Elevated nighttime temperature, whether from external heat or excessive bedding, disrupts these stages, leading to shallower sleep and reduced glucose control the following day. Studies have shown that when sleep temperature is optimized, insulin sensitivity improves and markers of inflammation decline. This is because deeper, uninterrupted sleep enhances growth hormone release, mitochondrial repair, and the clearance of metabolic waste products from the brain, all of which contribute to better metabolic function. Light exposure is another critical factor. The body's production of melatonin, the hormone that signals sleep onset, is heavily influenced by light in the blue spectrum. Prolonged exposure to bright or artificial light in the evening suppresses melatonin, delaying sleep onset and reducing sleep quality. Melatonin is not only a sleep hormone, but also a potent antioxidant with significant effects on mitochondrial efficiency and glucose metabolism. Its suppression by late night light exposure has been linked to impaired insulin sensitivity and elevated fasting glucose. Limiting exposure to screens, and artificial light for at least an hour before bed, or using low blue light settings can restore normal melatonin patterns and promote more restorative sleep. Beyond these behavioral elements, the consistency of sleep quality has a direct relationship with metabolic regulation. When individuals experience frequent awakenings or shortened sleep cycles, the body's ability to recover from daily metabolic stress diminishes. During deep sleep, insulin sensitivity is restored, and tissues such as muscle and liver recalibrate their ability to absorb and utilize glucose. This process is not gradual. It happens nightly and depends on the continuity of sleep. Each interruption reduces the time spent in these restorative phases, resulting in morning insulin resistance and elevated cortisol. The accumulation of fragmented sleep, even when total sleep time appears sufficient, creates the same metabolic strain as outright sleep deprivation. This underscores the importance of not just sleeping longer, but sleeping more efficiently and without disruption. Optimized sleep exerts far-reaching benefits that extend well beyond insulin control. It lowers systemic inflammation, stabilizes blood pressure, enhances lipid metabolism, and improves cognitive and emotional regulation, all factors that contribute to long-term health span. Sleep also modulates the gut microbiome, influencing the populations of bacteria that affect nutrient absorption, immune signaling, and glucose metabolism. When sleep patterns are erratic, gut microbial diversity decreases, leading to increased intestinal permeability and inflammatory signaling that feed back into metabolic dysfunction. By contrast, consistent and sufficient sleep strengthens this relationship, reducing oxidative stress and supporting efficient energy use across organ systems. The concept of treating sleep as a therapeutic tool represents a shift in how longevity science approaches metabolic health. Traditionally, medicine has focused on interventions that correct dysfunction after it appears: pharmacological control of blood sugar, lipid management, or weight reduction. Sleep optimization functions as preventive medicine, addressing the upstream mechanisms that cause these problems in the first place. It restores the body's natural capacity to regulate insulin without external aids, improves mitochondrial resilience, and slows biological aging at the cellular level. These changes are measurable in biomarkers such as fasting glucose, HbA1c, inflammatory cytokines, and even telomere length, all of which show improvement with consistent, high-quality sleep. In practical terms, the path to optimize sleep involves both behavioral and environmental strategies: maintaining a consistent sleep schedule, creating a dark and cool environment, reducing caffeine and alcohol intake in the evening, and engaging in calming pre-sleep routines such as reading or mindfulness all reinforce the body's readiness for rest. Regular physical activity during the day enhances sleep drive, while late night exercise should be avoided as it elevates core temperature and delays recovery. Nutritionally, avoiding heavy meals and refined carbohydrates close to bedtime prevents nighttime glucose spikes that can fragment sleep. Each of these small adjustments compounds to create a nightly environment in which insulin sensitivity can fully recover. When viewed through the lens of longevity, optimizing sleep becomes more than a lifestyle recommendation. It is a form of metabolic medicine. Each night of restorative sleep contributes to better hormonal balance, lower inflammation, and more efficient energy metabolism. Over time, these cumulative effects translate to a slower rate of biological aging and a lower risk of chronic disease. The science is clear that no supplement or pharmaceutical can replicate what the body naturally achieves through consistent, high-quality sleep. It is the cornerstone habit that enables all other interventions, diet, exercise, and stress management, to reach their full potential in promoting metabolic health and extending human health span.